to Third Floor Views, a production of Chesapeake Family Life, where we talk about health, education, and living with kids. I'm your host, Janet Jefferson. Today, we're here talking with Nancy Striniste, founder of Earlyspace and author of Nature Play at Home, creating outdoor spaces that connect children to the natural world. Thank you so much, Nancy, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Janet.
To our viewers, please feel free to ask any questions or drop any comments you have in the comment section, and we will try to address as many of those as we can. But Nancy, let's get started. So first, I really just want to talk about this concept of nature play. I think in some ways, we know what nature is and we know what play is, so it's like, okay, yep, that makes sense. But really tell us about the details, and let's go in a little bit to the pedagogy behind it and how it works and why it's important.
Well, nature play is as you said, it's children playing like unstructured time, and they're spending that time in the natural world. So interacting with natural materials like plants and plant parts and trees and tree parts and rocks and earth and water and all those things. And it can be in a natural wild environment or a
Hmm.
designed nature play space. Um, but and the things that children do are the things that they do in the course of play. So it might be physical activity, climbing and running and jumping and crawling and rolling and pushing and pulling and lifting and all those kinds of things, and pretending and creating and using their imaginations. So, but it's all happening in the natural world.
Mm-hmm. So I hear you already talking about how it hits on a couple levels of development, both gross motor skills, talking about jumping, running, and climbing. I'm sure also fine motor skills when, I'm thinking of my kids outside picking the holly berries individually off of the
Exactly.
tree.
Yeah.
And then all of that imaginative play, which we've learned is so important in terms of building creativity in adults and even flexibility. Um, so that talks just a little bit about my next question in terms of the benefits of nature play. Um, and and but if you could speak about like why is it so important to have that access to natural objects opposed to why is it different than just a playground? I mean, kids are outside, they're running around, they have fresh air. Why is a natural space, what benefits does it provide beyond like a traditional play structure?
Well, there is really an exploding body of research that has compared natural play spaces and play in nature to play in manufactured play spaces. And there really are some pretty striking differences. There's a whole series of studies that looks at children with attention deficit disorder and
Hmm.
finds that their symptoms are reduced when they're in green spaces, but not the same when they're playing basketball on a paved court. So it's something about the time in a natural setting that allows the part of your brain that's required for focused attention to relax, and it has to do with it's called attention restoration theory,
Hmm.
but it has to do with a sense of wonder and a sense of awe, and how that kind of uses a different part of your brain, and it's really important to balance that. um, but yeah, things like when they compare groups of children playing in natural spaces to playing in manufactured spaces, they find that um, that they're more physically active, so they're developing their strength and their stamina, and like their upper body strength and their balance, and some very specific kinds of things that they see happening. But also just that kids are more likely to play actively in a nature play space as
Hmm.
compared to a manufactured equipment playground, which is really surprising because you think that that's what manufactured play equipment is best at. But really, the theory is that it has to do with kids getting bored, that
Hmm.
manufactured play spaces don't change, they stay the same. And so if you're, especially in a schoolyard, if you're playing on that equipment day after day after day, it eventually gets kind of boring.
Hmm.
Whereas natural play and natural elements are always changing and evolving, and the theory is that that's what keeps kids engaged, and by staying engaged they're more likely to be physically active. But also time in nature builds our immune systems and reduces stress levels, and actually they see less conflict in a natural setting than in a kind of traditional schoolyard or manufactured play space.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So we talked, about how a natural play area has benefits over, your traditional jungle gym. And then you mentioned also the power of just playing out in the woods. How is a natural play area different from just playing in the woods? Does it have any benefits? And just in what ways is it different?
Playing in the woods is great. And if you have access to the woods, that's a wonderful thing. Um, and I think that childhood has really changed from definitely when I was a kid, where we had a lot more kind of right to roam, where
Mhm.
kids could disappear and be outside on their own for the whole day and come back at lunchtime or when the street lights came on at night or whatever. But children today don't tend to have those kinds of opportunities so much. So I think of nature play as more like bringing nature to the places where children are allowed to spend their time. So
Hmm.
that might be their backyards or their schoolyards or their childcare centers, or even the local parks.
Mhm.
Um, but it's the same elements, the same, for me, design palette of plants and trees and tree parts and rocks and sculpting the earth and sand and water and dirt, and all those things are what comprise a nature play space that is designed as opposed to wild.
Mhm. So it's really about accessibility, whether it be just proximity, if you don't have as much access to green space, a nature play area can provide that. But then also I think what you said is really interesting, how adults have created these constrictions on childhood that haven't always been there.
Mhm.
And nature play areas, it sounds like you're saying in some ways kind of safely in an adult's mind bring nature to the child so they can have those same kinds of experiences that are more allowed in our current culture.
Right, right. Yeah, I have this vision, this dream, whatever, to think about nature play corridors where
Mm.
people would link their backyards together, and everybody would have nature play spaces and kids would have the opportunity to run free. There's a, a concept in sustainable landscaping, which is, I kind of am in both the world of education and the world of sustainable landscaping, but um, that talks about wildlife corridors. That's
Right.
where you plant native plants and provide habitat and things for wildlife. And I like to think about that for children, providing habitat for childhood.
I love that idea so much. Um, Okay, I also want to just jump into your book because that's one of the things I really want to talk about today with you is, okay, here we are. A lot of us are trapped in our homes and we want to get out and experience nature as much as possible. But we want to do it in a safe way. But also, like, what an amazing opportunity to turn your backyard into this sort of really fun natural play space that is really engaging to kids. So, if you could just speak a little bit about your book, and then maybe give us a few tips and tricks on how we can turn our backyard or maybe even local natural space into more of a play area.
Yeah, well, so the book came out in the spring of 2019. So it's almost 2 years old now, and it's just going into its second printing, which is really exciting. And it's built on a foundation of the two worlds that I live in, which is sustainable landscaping and child development. So there's a lot of the why nature play is important and what it does for children, and it's broken up into chapters. It starts with kind of a big overview about how to think about arranging your space. Um, and then each of the chapters after that goes deeply into one area of play. So there are like inspiring imaginations, awakening senses, which has to do with um, fragrance and edible gardens and tactile elements and bringing sound into the environment. Um, and then there's a whole section on active play. Challenging Bodies is the name of that chapter. And then and inspiring imagination. So there's things about playhouses and different kinds of structures and enclosures and things that inspire pretend play. And then there's a whole section on loose parts. Loose parts
Mm,
is the term that refers to just anything that children can move and manipulate. So in this case, it would be a lot of natural materials, things like sticks and stumps and tree cookies and rocks and, seed pods and plant parts and all those kinds of things. Um, but also manufactured or, man-made kinds of things like planks and boxes and
mm,
blankets and pots and pans from the kitchen and all those kinds of things. And and so that's the thing that I always feel is kind of a great starting point for people, is to just think about adding loose parts to
mm,
your backyard or to your schoolyard, because they offer children a real sense of control. That the idea that children can build things and arrange things and move things around and change things and kind of be in charge of their space is just such an important concept for healthy development, but even more so now during COVID when so much is out of their control. And
mhm,
and this is a way to give children just a little bit of that back.
mhm.
So, oh, but so I kind of digress. So, but back to the book. So there are all these chapters, and then it includes a lot of instructions for DIY activities, how to build things, like how to build a hill and put an embankment slide into it, or
Oh, that's awesome.
how to use tree parts for play, and strip the bark and round the corners and things like that, and how to build a sand pit. And there's just a bunch of those step-by-step activities. And then the other thing, because I'm a landscape designer and I love plants, there are, I don't know, maybe 20 or so plant lists that are organized around different themes. So there's fragrant plants and eating the rainbow, and plants to attract pollinators and insects, and just plants with good parts for children to pick and play with. And so the idea is to really give parents or anyone who reads the book everything that they need to be able to think about why they're doing this and then know how to do it.
So what it sounds like you were saying loose parts is probably your, quickest and easiest suggestion for parents who wanna sort of slide their way into this and try it out. So with that, would you recommend just, like, buying a bag of rocks or a big, thing of sand and just creating these just little areas where kids can poke about?
Yeah, absolutely. Or just, if a branch falls off a tree,
Mhm.
don't throw
Keep
it
it.
away. Keep
Right,
it.
right.
Yeah. Or even, go out with your saw and cut different lengths. The idea of tree cookies is something that I just love. And they can be from little tiny things that kids use for stacking or building fairy houses or whatever, to big pieces that are seats or plates when they're playing in the sand. Or um so just a saw and a tree branch is a way to get yourself started.
Yeah, I love that. It's so easy. It's so, accessible.
Yeah.
So you wrote this book and, But it really came from all your time as, a landscape architect and your work creating these amazing play spaces. Could you speak just a little bit about, the organization Earlyspace and the different sort of projects that you do with Earlyspace?
Mhm. So I started out a really long time ago, like more than 3 decades ago now, um, as an early childhood educator. So I had an undergrad degree in education and I was a teacher. But as a teacher, I got really interested in making materials and rearranging my classroom space and just thinking about the role of the physical environment in children's learning and development. And so I started, taking classes and workshops and things, and then eventually started giving classes and workshops and things for other teachers, and that led to some consulting. And our family moved around a few times and things, but um, so I started a consulting business designing actually both indoor and outdoor spaces for children, and and that has evolved over the years into just a complete focus on designing outdoor spaces for children. So I think of them as natural play and learning spaces, and my clients are mostly schools and early childhood programs, and sometimes I work on public park
Mhm.
designs. I'm working on a project now in an affordable housing community where we're doing some nature play spaces on the grounds there.
Oh,
So
that's great.
so those things, but then I also still have a really strong connection to teachers and training teachers. So I teach in a program at Antioch University in New England every year. They have it's called Nature Based Early Childhood, and it's a graduate program. And I teach the landscape design for
Mm,
outdoor
mhm.
play and learning class, which is something that I really love doing. And and I do a lot of speaking and teacher training. And then I also have an online class on my website that people can register for, and it has um, a bunch of recorded webinars that lead you through step-by-step process of understanding your site and deciding what you want and coming up with a design, and then how to have like a community build day,
Hmm,
working with volunteers or working with contractors to help
mhm.
you build your space. So but a lot of what I do is actually working with organizations and actually building nature play spaces.
Mm, mhm. Um, so you have designed a lot of different play spaces. I was wondering if maybe you could give us maybe a short list of either your own designs or some other great examples of what a nature play area looks like that maybe some of our viewers or listeners could actually have the opportunity to go and check out. So
Mhm.
just around Maryland or Virginia or other sort of within driving distance of the greater DC area.
Well, there are lots of schools and early childhood programs that have nature play spaces, but those, especially during COVID, aren't really open to the public. But the one that I did a few years ago in Gaithersburg is called Constitution Gardens Park, and it's in Old Town Gaithersburg. You could, look it up to get the address. But it's the first public park in the whole capital area, that municipal public park, that
Mhm.
is really completely focused on nature play. And so it has a big hill with some slides in it and stumps that you can climb up, and has a giant sand play area, and it has loose parts. It has a stream with a pump that kids can pump water, and logs and things to climb on. So that's a fun place. Um, but I'm also part of an organization called it's Maryland's Project Green Classroom Nature Play Working Group, and we do a conference every year on nature play where we help people in parks and early childhood programs and schools to think about creating nature play spaces on their property. And this year we did our conference all online, of course. Um, But we've also facilitated the building of some nature play spaces around the state. So one that comes to mind right in downtown Baltimore
Mm,
is in the Druid Heights neighborhood,
mhm.
and it's the Elijah Cummings Park, and it's a nature play space. So that's a cool place right downtown in the city. And then another one that that I think is really wonderful is at Carrie Murray Nature Center, also in Baltimore. But if
Oh,
you
great.
go on the website, and I think I gave you the
Mhm,
link for the website for the Maryland Working Group on Nature Play, there is like an interactive map that lists,
mhm.
you can click and find nature play spaces around the state.
Perfect, perfect. Um, so in May, you became a member of the leadership team for the National COVID-19 Outdoor Learning Initiative. I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about COVID and how it's changed maybe your perception of nature play and where you think it's going.
Um, yeah, well, this was an initiative started by a colleague of mine. Her name is Sharon Danks, and she's the founder of an organization called um, Green Schoolyards America. And and she and some of her colleagues, she's out in Berkeley, kind of had started thinking about the idea of how to reopen schools after they were closed for COVID, and all of us being lifelong advocates for outdoor learning and nature play, that was just the logical thing. We knew the science was telling us that the virus is much less likely to be transmitted outdoors and away from, HVAC systems and air filtration and things like that. Um, so we started working together back in June, and it's just been the most exciting thing to be involved in during this kind of very strange and scary time. So we've been focused on, I would say, three things: helping schools to reopen safely during COVID using outdoor spaces, um, and we've done that by creating a what we're calling the National Outdoor Learning Library, which is just an extensive body of work, resources, and tools designed to help schools figure out all the details of how to make it happen. And it doesn't have to be complicated, but there are a lot of things to think about. It can be just as simple as a teacher taking her class outside and sitting under a tree and reading a
Mhm,
story, but it can
mhm,
be, building shelters and making sure that there's equitable access to the clothing and gear that every child needs to be warm and dry outside all day.
right, right.
Um, and so we've been creating these resources. We also have a every other week online meeting of what we call the community of practice, which is schools that are up and running outdoors and schools and districts that are still planning for it or even still trying to decide to do it.
Mhm,
And it's just a really powerful gathering of people every other week where we hear about new resources. We have presentations from schools from Maine to Texas, and every climate and every part of the country that are actually up and running outdoors. And sometimes they're small private schools, but more and more we're getting whole districts that are taking the plunge and reopening outdoors.
that's
Um,
fantastic, and how is it going? How is it going with people who are actually doing it?
they love it. I
Oh,
mean,
that's
what we
fantastic.
keep hearing is we're never going back inside. And and that's what we really hope. I mean, that's outdoor learning is something that we all really believe in. We know that it's good for children. Um, and that greening your schoolyard can be really good for the environment, to think
Mhm,
about um, transforming schoolyards from these kind of asphalt covered spaces, which a lot of them are, into more park like settings with thinking about wildlife habitat and climate and stormwater management and all those kinds of things. Um, but the other thing that our initiative is doing that's really exciting is we have a group called the Emergency Schoolyard Design Volunteers, who are landscape professionals, landscape architects and designers, practitioners and professors and students from across the country who are volunteering their time to help schools who are having trouble kind of visualizing how it would work on their campus. And and so we're matching up those volunteers with schools and trying to prioritize the Title I schools and the schools with the highest need, because there is a huge equity issue.
Yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely. Let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about equity. What are your thoughts on how to make nature play or nature access more equitable? Because historically, at least in the past, so many decades, it has been a real challenge for low income students to have that access, especially when you're thinking about inner city kids. It's really hard for them to have a green space to play. So, what are some of your thoughts or suggestions on how we can be better at that?
Um,
I
yeah,
know, big question.
well, it's something that we've been thinking a lot about as part of this initiative because, there are some statistics that say 60% of kids who are issued, with school issued devices never opened them. They're just losing
Wow.
track of lots of children who don't have, maybe the support in their family or the access to Wi-Fi or whatever. Um, and so it's really important to get, we think, to get everybody back in person and use the outdoor spaces. Um, and traditionally, even before COVID, I would say that many of the schools that had active outdoor learning programs had it because of parents who took the initiative to make that happen. So
Mhm,
more like PTA, kind of
mhm.
grassroots funded and initiated projects, um, which tended to mean that children in lower income schools where parents maybe were working more hours or more jobs or just didn't have the capacity to do the same kind of advocacy and volunteering and fundraising
Mhm,
that wealthier schools had. So we just feel like it's really important for there to be not only the grassroots efforts, but also the kind of top down, system wide, district wide strategic planning for for giving every child access to outdoor learning and to nature outside the door of their classroom. And there's some great research that says that even just having a view of a tree out your window, out your classroom window, raises test scores.
wow.
So there's lots of reason
Right.
we know that this is good for children. Oh, and in fact, I want to mention a colleague of mine. Her name is Claire Latenay. She's the brains behind the emergency schoolyard design volunteer program, and she teaches at Cal Poly Pomona. But she just wrote a book called Schools That Heal,
Mm,
um, that'll be coming out in June, and it is all about the idea that the research is there telling us what to do, telling us what's good for children, what children need, and now that just needs to move into the world of architects and landscape architects and school boards and the people that the decision makers about
mhm,
what schools look like and what they provide for children, and just the whole idea of really centering what we know is best for children as opposed to what's easy to maintain.
mhm. Yeah, so it sounds like you're saying that, the research is so clear. Like, this is something we need. We need it for everybody. It needs to be equitable and available to all. And now we're at the point where we really just need to get the policymakers on board. And so it's almost becoming, this is an advocacy issue in terms of how to get local officials. Signed on to this because I think it is, as you said, a little bit of a deviation between what we had set up in terms of your classic school building with a parking lot and basketball courts, and maybe a green, if they're lucky, a green field for soccer or
Right.
whatever. So it is different from what I think a lot of traditional American schools have been doing. So the next steps is how can we change that?
Right.
Um, well, it sounds like we have some work to do.
We do. It has been exciting. So far, 3 states have incorporated the guidelines that the national initiative has come up with. Wisconsin, I think New Mexico, and I think it's on the way in Maine.
Hmm.
Um, and we're just hoping that that's going to happen more and more. That state level and district level um, decision makers will get on board now that these resources and materials that we've been creating over the past 6 months are
Mhm.
up and available.
Well, that's exciting. That's really exciting. So hopefully we can hear more in the future about positive change coming.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy, for talking to us today about nature play and how to incorporate it into your own personal backyard for your kids, but then also into your community and schools. Thank you also to all of our viewers and listeners. Make sure that you visit ChesapeakeFamily.com for up-to-date local information on health, home, and living for today's Maryland parent. This episode will be archived on ChesapeakeFamily.com in video and podcast format. And you will also find all of the links that Nancy mentioned as well. They'll be up with this video. So I'm Janet Jefferson with Chesapeake Family Life and Third Floor Views. Thank you so much.